It started like any other road trip. The open road stretched out before me, and the dusty horizon seemed to shimmer with the promise of adventure. I had just finished my last year of college and wanted to take a solo trip to clear my head before the chaos of adulthood consumed me. I mapped out a route through the back roads of the Midwest, where small towns and eerie landscapes gave the trip an old-school American charm. The first couple of days were uneventful. I passed through sleepy little towns, stopped at roadside diners with faded signs, and camped out under a sky full of stars. The isolation was peaceful until it wasn't. It started on the third night, somewhere in Kansas. I was driving along a two-lane highway surrounded by nothing but endless fields of corn. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the road was bathed in the faint glow of my headlights. I noticed a beat-up truck following me. At first, I didn't think much of it, but then it stayed with me, mile after mile. Every time I changed lanes or slowed down, the truck mirrored my movements. Its headlights were blinding, and I could feel the driver's presence like a weight on my chest. After about 10 minutes, I decided to pull off at a gas station that appeared like a mirage in the dark. The gas station was old, almost ancient. Its neon sign flickered, and the single pump looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1950s. I parked and got out, pretending to check my tires while keeping an eye on the truck. To my relief, it drove past without stopping. The gas station attendant, a wiry man with hollow eyes, leaned out of the window of the small office. "Long way from anywhere, ain't ya?" he asked, his voice gravely. "Yeah," I replied, trying to sound casual. "Just passing through." His gaze shifted to the road where the truck had disappeared. "Be careful out there," he said. "These roads have a way of swallowing people whole." I laughed nervously, but his words stuck with me. I filled up my tank quickly and got back on the road, eager to put distance between myself and that eerie little station. About an hour later, I saw the truck again. This time, it wasn't just following me, it was tailgating, its high beams flooding my car with light. I sped up, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The truck matched my speed, staying uncomfortably close. I thought about pulling over, but something told me that stopping wasn't an option. My heart raced as I pushed the gas pedal to the floor. The truck fell back slightly, but it didn't disappear. After what felt like an eternity, I saw a sign for a rest stop up ahead. I veered into the exit lane and pulled into the parking lot, which was eerily empty. And so the truck didn't follow. I sat in my car for a moment, trying to steady my breathing. The rest stop was lit by a few dim streetlights, and the building itself looked abandoned. Still, I decided to go inside to use the bathroom and collect myself. The air inside was stale, and the fluorescent lights flickered like they were on their last legs. The restroom was empty, as expected. As I washed my hands, I heard a noise, a faint shuffling sound coming from one of the stalls. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I leaned down to check under the stall doors. Nothing. As I turned to leave, the lights went out, plunging the restroom into complete darkness. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for my phone to use the flashlight. The beam of light from my phone cut through the dark, and that's when I saw it. A face. It was reflected in the mirror behind me, pale, with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. I screamed and spun around, but there was no one there. My heart pounding, I bolted out of the restroom and ran back to my car. I didn't care where I was going, I just needed to get away. As I sped down the highway, I realized the truck was back. But this time, it wasn't behind me, it was ahead. Its taillights glowed like red eyes, and it seemed to be waiting for me. The truck started moving as I approached, keeping just ahead of me no matter how fast I went. It led me off the highway and onto a narrow dirt road that wound through the cornfields. I didn't want to follow, but I couldn't seem to stop myself. The road ended at an old farmhouse, its windows dark and its roof sagging with age. The truck parked in front, and its engine died. I stayed in my car, too scared to move. The truck's driver's door opened, but no one got out. And then, I saw them. Shadows. Dozens of them, moving through the cornfields toward my car. They had no discernible features, just dark shapes that seemed to ripple and flicker like smoke. The shadows surrounded my car, pressing against the windows. I couldn't hear anything except my own ragged breathing, but I could feel them, cold, malevolent, and hungry. Suddenly, the truck's headlights turned on, illuminating the farmhouse. The door creaked open, and I saw the same pale face from the mirror staring back at me. I don't remember much after that. When I woke up, it was morning, and I was parked on the side of the highway. There was no sign of the truck, the farmhouse, or the shadows. My car was fine, but my phone's battery was dead, and my gas tank was empty, even though I had just filled it the night before. I made it to the nearest town on foot and called for help. When I told the locals about what had happened, they exchanged uneasy glances. "You were on Harlan Road," one of them said. "That place is cursed. Folks go missing out there all the time." I've never been able to explain what happened that night, but every time I drive past a cornfield, I feel like I'm being watched.
Story number 2.
It's hard to talk about what happened without feeling like I'm inviting it back into my life. But maybe if I share it, someone else will stay safe. It was the summer of 2019, and I was driving from Dallas to Denver to visit my sister. I decided to take the scenic route through New Mexico, a long stretch of desolation and beauty. I wanted the solitude. I needed the quiet. I never expected it to turn into a nightmare. The trouble started just before dusk. I had been driving for hours without seeing another car. The desert stretched endlessly on either side of me, a sea of reddish sand and scrub bushes. The only sound was the hum of my tires on the pavement and the occasional crackle of static from the radio. Then I saw it. A figure was standing on the side of the road. It was tall, unnaturally so, and wrapped in tattered clothes that flapped in the dry wind. Its face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, and it held a long walking stick in one hand. I slowed down instinctively, but something in my gut told me not to stop. The figure didn't move as I passed, but I swear I felt its gaze, cold and heavy, boring into me. I drove faster, trying to shake the unease. But the road ahead stretched endlessly, and the sinking sun painted the horizon with shades of blood. About 20 minutes later, I glanced in my rearview mirror. My heart dropped into my stomach. The figure was there, standing in the middle of the road, even though I had left it miles behind. I told myself it wasn't possible. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe it was a trick of the light. But when I looked again, it was still there. I pressed the gas pedal harder, my car surging forward. The road twisted and turned, but the figure never disappeared from my mirror. It just stood there, watching. As night fell, my headlights illuminated a sign for a rest area a few miles ahead. I decided to stop and collect myself, thinking that maybe I was just tired or hallucinating. The rest area was small, with a few picnic tables and a single vending machine. The lights in the bathroom flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the cracked concrete. I got out of my car, every nerve in my body on edge. That's when I heard it. A faint tapping sound, like someone knocking on wood. It came from the direction of the picnic tables. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. I took a step closer, my heart pounding. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. And then I saw it. Sitting on one of the picnic tables was a doll, old and ragged, its porcelain face cracked and its eyes staring blankly ahead. Its tiny hands were drumming against the tabletop, though there was no wind, no strings, no explanation. I backed away, my breath coming in short gasps. That's when I noticed something even worse. The figure, the one I had seen on the side of the road, was standing in the shadows just beyond the reach of the flickering light. It wasn't alone. Dozens of other shapes moved behind it, some crawling on all fours, others shambling upright like broken marionettes. Their eyes glinted in the darkness, and their movements were jerky, unnatural. I bolted for my car, slamming the door shut and fumbling to start the engine. As I peeled out of the rest area, I saw the figure again in my rearview mirror, but this time it was closer. I don't know how long I drove that night. Time felt slippery, and the road seemed endless. The radio turned to static no matter which station I tried, and my phone had no signal. At some point, I realized I wasn't alone in the car. The back seat felt heavier, as if someone or something was sitting there. I didn't dare look. I just kept driving, gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I whispered prayers, promises, anything to make it stop. Finally, as dawn broke, the weight lifted and the oppressive silence in the car eased. I pulled into the first gas station I saw, a dilapidated place on the edge of a small town. The attendant, a middle-aged woman with a weary expression, took one look at me and said, "You saw them, didn't you?" I nodded, unable to speak. "They don't like outsiders," she said, her voice low. "Whatever you do, don't drive that road again." I never have. I don't know what I encountered out there, but sometimes when I'm driving at night, I catch a glimpse of a figure in my rearview mirror. It's never there when I turn around, but I know it's watching.
Story number 3.
I can't explain what happened that night, and maybe I shouldn't try. But if you're ever driving through the Appalachian back roads late at night, you need to know. Some places aren't meant to be disturbed. It started as an innocent trip to visit my friend Ethan, who had just moved to a small cabin in the mountains of West Virginia. He had been texting me all week, excited for me to see his new place. The directions were simple enough, and my GPS worked at first. It was just past midnight when I hit the back roads. The trees formed a dense canopy overhead, blotting out the moonlight. My car's headlights barely cut through the fog that rolled in like ghostly tendrils. The first sign of trouble was my phone losing signal. I wasn't worried at first. This was the middle of nowhere, after all. But as the road narrowed and the forest pressed closer, I started to feel uneasy. I glanced at my gas gauge. Half a tank. Enough to get there, I reassured myself. Then I saw it. A woman standing on the side of the road. She was barefoot, her dress torn and muddy, her hair hanging in wet clumps around her face. Her head was bowed, and she didn't move as my car approached. I slowed down instinctively, but a voice in my head screamed, "Don't stop." I rolled down my window a crack. "Are you okay?" I called out. She didn't answer. Instead, her head snapped up and her eyes locked onto mine. They were wrong. Too dark, too hollow, like black pits that swallowed the light. My heart thundered in my chest as I slammed on the gas and sped past her. As I drove, the forest seemed to close in around me. The road twisted and turned, and no matter how far I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. And then I saw her again. The same woman, standing in the middle of the road this time. She was closer to my car, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. It didn't make sense. There was no way she could have gotten ahead of me. I swerved to avoid her, my tires skidding on the gravel shoulder. My car spun out, and I came to a stop just inches from a ditch. Breathing hard, I looked in my rearview mirror. She was gone. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel and trying to calm down. That's when I noticed something else. The forest was silent, not just quiet, completely, unnaturally silent. No crickets, no rustling leaves, no distant howls. Just nothing. I tried to start my car. The engine sputtered but wouldn't turn over. "Come on," I whispered, turning the key again and again. A soft tapping sound made me freeze. It was coming from the passenger side window. Slowly, I turned my head. She was there, her face pressed against the glass, her mouth stretched into a grotesque grin that revealed too many teeth. I screamed and scrambled to lock the doors, but the locks clicked on their own, unlocking. The door creaked open, though I swear I hadn't touched it. And then she was gone. I don't remember much after that. Somehow, I got the car started and drove blindly through the twisting roads, tears streaming down my face. I didn't care where I ended up as long as it was away from that place. When I finally found a gas station, it was nearly dawn. The clerk gave me a strange look as I stumbled inside, disheveled and shaking. "You okay?" he asked. "No," I said. "There was something out there. A woman." His expression darkened. "You were on Devil's Hollow, weren't you?" I nodded. He shook his head, muttering something under his breath. Then he looked me in the eye and said, "You're lucky to be alive. Most folks who see her don't make it back. I've never driven through those mountains again, and sometimes late at night I hear that soft tapping sound in my dreams."
Story number 4.
It was supposed to be an easy drive. A quick overnight trip from Phoenix to Las Vegas for my cousin's wedding. I'd driven that route a dozen times before, always taking the same lonely stretch of Highway 93 that cuts through the Mojave Desert. But this time felt different from the moment I left. The first sign was the storm. The weather had been clear when I started, but halfway through the drive, a heavy, unnatural fog descended. It clung to the road, making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. My headlights struggled to penetrate the thick, swirling gray, and the silence outside felt suffocating. The second sign was the gas station. I don't remember seeing it on any of my previous trips. It appeared out of nowhere, a flickering neon sign that read, "Last Stop Gas." My tank was half full, but something about the place made me pull in anyway. The building looked old, almost ancient, with weathered wood and a single dim bulb above the door. A lone attendant stood behind the counter, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes too wide and unblinking. "Heading north?" he asked as I paid for my gas. "Yeah," I replied. "Be careful," he said. "There's things out there tonight, things you don't want to meet." I laughed nervously, brushing off his words as local superstition. But as I got back in my car, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling his warning left behind. The third sign was the hitchhiker. It was about 2 a.m. when I saw him on the side of the road, standing just outside the reach of my headlights. He was tall, his face hidden beneath the brim of a cowboy hat. and he held a small duffel bag in one hand. I'm not in the habit of picking up strangers, but something about him felt compelling. Against my better judgment, I pulled over and rolled down the passenger window. "Need a ride?" I asked. He nodded silently and got in without a word. We drove in silence for a while. He didn't say much, just stared out the window at the fog. Something about him made the air in the car feel heavy, like the weight of 100 secrets was pressing down on us. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "So where are you headed?" He turned to look at me, and my stomach dropped. His eyes weren't normal. They were dark, almost black, and seemed to shimmer like oil on water. "Nowhere you'd want to go," he said, his voice low and gravelly. I tried to laugh it off, but it came out shaky. "All right then." That's when the radio turned on by itself. Static crackled through the speakers, loud and grating. I reached to turn it off, but the dial wouldn't budge. The static grew louder, more distorted, until it sounded like whispers, hundreds of voices overlapping, too fast and too faint to understand. "Don't stop driving," the hitchhiker said suddenly. "What?" I asked, panic creeping into my voice. "Don't stop, no matter what you see." Before I could respond, the fog outside thickened and shapes began to emerge. At first, they were just shadows, indistinct and fleeting. But then they became clearer. Figures lined the sides of the road, dozens of them standing still as statues. Their faces were wrong, their features distorted like melted wax. They turned to watch us as we passed, their heads moving in unison. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. "What the hell is this?" I whispered. "Keep driving," the hitchhiker repeated. The figures began to move, stepping closer to the road. Their mouths opened, but no sound came out. One of them reached out as we sped past, its long, twisted fingers scraping against the side of the car with a metallic screech. I slammed on the gas, pushing the car as fast as it could go. The figures didn't chase us. They didn't need to. They just kept appearing, always ahead, always watching. Finally, the road curved, and we emerged from the fog into the clear desert night. I glanced in the rearview mirror, but there was nothing behind us. The hitchhiker let out a long breath, as if he'd been holding it the entire time. "What the hell was that?" I demanded, my voice shaking. He didn't answer. Instead, he opened the door and stepped out, even though we were still moving. I slammed on the brakes and turned to look, but he was gone. Just gone. There was no trace of him, no footprints, no sign he had ever been there. I drove the rest of the way in silence, my hands trembling on the wheel. When I finally reached my cousin's house, I told myself it was just a nightmare, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But the next morning, I found long, deep scratches on the side of my car, scratches that hadn't been there before. And when I looked at the map, I realized there was no gas station called Last Stop Gas anywhere along Highway 93.
Story number 5.
The year was 2017, and I was driving through the swamps of Louisiana on my way to New Orleans. I had taken a wrong turn somewhere near the Atchafalaya Basin, and my GPS was no help. It kept rerouting me down endless, twisting roads that all looked the same. The sky was growing darker, and a storm was brewing. Thick clouds hung low, casting the wetlands into an eerie half-light. I told myself I'd find a gas station soon, or at least a spot to pull over and figure things out. But then I saw the bridge. It was an old, rickety thing, barely wide enough for one car, stretching over a murky expanse of water. A hand-painted sign next to it read, "Duval Crossing, enter at your own risk." Something about that sign made my stomach churn, but I was out of options. The road behind me had been endless, and the storm was rolling in fast. I took a deep breath, gripped the wheel, and drove onto the bridge. The wooden planks creaked loudly under the weight of my car, and the water below was so still it looked like black glass. As I reached the middle of the bridge, a strange sound reached my ears, a faint humming, almost like someone singing just out of range. I rolled down my window to listen, but the sound stopped immediately. Then my car stalled. Panic surged as I tried to restart the engine. The headlights flickered but wouldn't stay on, leaving me in near total darkness. The only light came from flashes of distant lightning illuminating the swamp. That's when I saw her. A woman was standing at the far end of the bridge, her long, wet hair clinging to her face. She was barefoot and wearing a tattered white dress that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. She didn't move. She just stood there, staring at me. I honked the horn, hoping she'd step aside, but she didn't even flinch. Instead, she began walking toward me, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden planks. Her movements were slow, deliberate, and wrong, like each step was slightly out of sync with reality. I locked the doors and tried the ignition again. The engine sputtered to life and the headlights came back on, but the woman was gone. Relieved, I started driving forward. But as I passed the spot where she had been standing, something slammed against the side of my car with a force so strong it nearly knocked me off the bridge. I screamed and floored the gas, desperate to reach the other side. The humming started again, louder this time, almost like a chorus of voices. It filled the car, vibrating in my chest, and I felt an overwhelming urge to stop, to turn around, to get out. I fought it, gripping the wheel like my life depended on it. Finally, I reached the other side of the bridge and sped down the road without looking back. But the nightmare wasn't over. About 10 minutes later, I saw her again, standing in the middle of the road. I swerved to avoid her, nearly crashing into a ditch. When I looked back, she was gone. But the humming continued, growing louder and more insistent. I drove as fast as I could, the road blurring in my peripheral vision. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the humming stopped, and the road ahead opened into a familiar stretch of highway. I didn't stop until I reached a well-lit gas station near Baton Rouge. The clerk gave me a strange look as I stumbled inside, pale and shaking. "You came through Duval Crossing, didn't you?" he asked. I nodded, too shaken to speak. He sighed and shook his head. "That bridge has been cursed for over a century. They say a woman drowned there on her wedding night, and now she haunts the crossing. She won't rest until she takes someone else with her." I didn't want to believe him, but when I got back to my car, I saw muddy footprints on the hood, small, bare, and impossibly wet.
Story number 6.
I don't know why I took that road. It was late, and I was trying to shave a couple of hours off my drive from Chicago to a cabin in northern Wisconsin. My GPS showed a shortcut, a narrow, unmarked road through dense woods. I should have ignored it, but exhaustion and impatience got the better of me. The road was pitch black, lined with towering trees that seemed to press closer the farther I went. My headlights barely cut through the darkness, and the occasional rustle in the underbrush set my nerves on edge. About 20 minutes in, I noticed something strange. No signs, no mile markers, no other cars. It was as if I had driven straight off the map. That's when I saw the sign. It was an old, rusted thing, nailed to a tree and barely legible in the dim light. It read, "Esker Pines, population T." I chuckled nervously. What kind of joke was that? But as I drove on, unease settled in the pit of my stomach. The forest grew thicker, the trees gnarled and twisted like frozen figures. My radio cut to static and my phone lost signal entirely. Then, in the distance, I saw the lights. A small, isolated town appeared out of nowhere, its streets lined with old-fashioned lampposts that cast a flickering yellow glow. The buildings were weathered and crooked as if they'd been standing there for centuries. Relieved to find some semblance of civilization, I pulled into what looked like the main square. A gas station sat on one corner, its sign reading, "Open 24 hours." Across the street was a diner with a flickering neon sign that simply said, "Eats." I decided to check the diner first, hoping someone could tell me where I was. The moment I stepped inside, I knew something was wrong. The place was eerily silent, despite being full of people. They were all sitting at the tables, motionless, their heads tilted down as if staring at their plates. Hello?" I called out. No one responded. I stepped closer, my shoes squeaking on linoleum. That's when I noticed their hands. They weren't moving. In fact, they weren't even holding utensils. Their fingers were rigid, curled into unnatural positions, and their skin looked waxy, almost plastic. I leaned in closer to one of them, a woman in a floral dress. Her head snapped up so fast I stumbled back. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and filled with terror. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. And then, as if on cue, every single person in the diner turned their heads to look at me. I bolted for the door, slamming it behind me as I ran back to my car. The town was dark now, the lampposts extinguished, the windows of the buildings black. I jumped into the driver's seat, fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I floored the gas, speeding out of the square and back onto the narrow road. But no matter how far I drove, the town wouldn't disappear. Every time I thought I'd escaped, I'd see those same flickering lampposts, that same rusted sign, that same diner. It was like I was trapped in a loop. Desperation set in as the clock on my dashboard blinked 3:33 a.m. over and over, never changing. Finally, I pulled over, my hands shaking, and screamed into the darkness. That's when I heard the whisper. It came from the trees, low and guttural, like 100 voices speaking in unison. You shouldn't have come. The headlights flickered, and the trees around me seemed to move, their twisted branches reaching toward the car. Shadows emerged from the woods, dozens of them. Their shapes wrong, too long, too thin, with faces that didn't make sense. I slammed on the gas, my tires kicking up dirt as I sped forward. The figures followed, keeping pace with my car no matter how fast I went. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it ended. I burst onto a familiar highway, the morning sun rising over the horizon. My phone buzzed to life in the cup holder, and the clock on the dashboard read 7:42 a.m. I didn't stop until I reached my cabin, locking every door and window behind me. I've never been able to find that road again. No matter how much I search maps or try to retrace my route, it's as if Esker Pines never existed. But sometimes late at night, I hear whispers outside my window, and I swear I see flickering lampposts in the distance.
Story number 7.
It was supposed to be a simple road trip. Just me, my best friend Sarah, and the open highway. We were heading to Colorado for a music festival, excited for a weekend of fun and freedom. But what we found on that deserted stretch of road has haunted me ever since. We'd left late in the evening, hoping to avoid the summer heat. By the time we hit the back roads of Kansas, it was close to midnight. The stars were out, and the moon cast a pale glow over the endless fields of corn. It was peaceful at first, but as the hours stretched on, the isolation became oppressive. No other cars, no streetlights, just the narrow road winding through the dark. That's when we saw the house. It appeared out of nowhere, a 2-story farmhouse set back from the road, its windows glowing faintly. There was no driveway leading to it, no signs of life, just a house in the middle of nowhere. Creepy, Sarah said, snapping a picture with her phone. I laughed nervously and kept driving, but the image of that house stuck in my mind. 10 minutes later, we saw it again. Same house, same faintly glowing windows, same emptiness. Did we turn around? Sarah asked, her voice uneasy. No, I said, though doubt crept in. We've been going straight. The road twisted and turned, but we hadn't made any intentional changes in direction. And yet, there it was again. The third time we passed the house, I pulled over. This isn't funny, Sarah said. I'm not doing it on purpose. I snapped, checking the GPS. It was useless, a spinning circle of loading that never resolved. Let's just keep going, she said, her eyes darting nervously to the cornfields around us. I nodded, but unease prickled at my skin. As we drove, the air inside the car grew heavy like the pressure before a storm. The cornfields seemed taller, the stalks bending unnaturally as if they were leaning toward the road. And then, the headlights caught something ahead. A figure stood in the middle of the road. At first, I thought it was a person, but as we got closer, I realized it was all wrong. It was too tall, its limbs too thin and elongated. Its face was pale and featureless, except for 2 deep black pits where its eyes should have been. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop just feet from the figure. It didn't move. What the hell is that? Sarah whispered, clutching my arm. I don't know, I said, my voice trembling. Then it tilted its head as if curious and took a slow, deliberate step toward the car. Go, Sarah screamed. I threw the car into reverse, my tires squealing as I backed away. But when I glanced in the rearview mirror, the house was there again, closer this time, its windows burning with an unnatural orange light. We're trapped, I whispered, dread washing over me. The figure took another step forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. Without thinking, I turned the wheel and drove into the cornfield. The stalks whipped against the car, the sound deafening. But I didn't stop. Sarah was crying, clutching her phone as if it could save her, but there was no signal. After what felt like hours of driving blindly through the corn, we burst onto another road. It was unfamiliar but empty, and the oppressive feeling that had surrounded us began to lift. We didn't stop until we reached a gas station miles away. The clerk looked up as we stumbled inside, disheveled and shaking. You two look like you've seen a ghost, he said with a chuckle. Have you ever heard of a house on this road? I asked, my voice hoarse. His smile faded. You saw it, didn't you? The old Miller house? I nodded. He shook his head, his expression grim. That house burned down in the 40s. Folks say it shows up sometimes, trapping people who take the wrong road. They never come back. We left the gas station in silence, driving straight to Colorado without another stop. Sarah refuses to talk about that night. She deleted the picture she'd taken, saying it gave her nightmares. As for me, I avoid back roads altogether, because every now and then, in the dead of night, I see a faint orange glow in the distance, and I swear I hear the rustling of corn.
Story number 8.
It started with a detour sign. I was driving through the Appalachian Mountains on my way to a friend's wedding in West Virginia. The route was familiar, one I'd taken several times before, but this time a bright orange detour sign pointed me down a side road I didn't recognize. The road was narrow, winding through dense trees that seemed to close in the farther I drove. My GPS hadn't registered the detour, but I figured it was a temporary change, just a minor inconvenience. 10 minutes in, the forest grew darker, the sunlight barely piercing the canopy above. The road became rough, riddled with potholes, and I began to feel uneasy. That's when I saw the man. He was standing on the shoulder, wearing a weathered suit and a wide-brimmed hat. His head was down, obscuring his face, and his posture was unnaturally still. As I passed him, his head jerked up and caught a glimpse of his face in the rearview mirror. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were black, completely black, with no whites or irises. I sped up, my heart pounding. The road twisted and turned, each curve more disorienting than the last. The trees grew denser, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. My GPS was still useless, the screen frozen on the last stretch of highway I'd been on. Then the road opened into a clearing, and there it was. A small, crumbling motel with a faded sign that read, "Rest Easy Inn." I don't know why I stopped. Maybe it was the isolation, the creeping dread that had settled in my chest, or the fact that I hadn't seen another car for miles. But something about the place felt wrong. The parking lot was empty except for a single rusted truck. The building itself was decrepit, its paint peeling and windows dark. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside. The lobby smelled of mildew and old wood. A small bell sat on the counter, and behind it was a man with a gaunt face and sunken eyes. "Need a room?" he asked, his voice flat and cold. "No," I said quickly. "I'm just lost." He stared at me for a long moment, then nodded toward the door. "Best get back on the road. Don't stay out here after dark." His words sent a chill down my spine. I didn't ask for clarification. I just turned and walked out. As I climbed back into my car, I noticed something odd. The man I'd seen earlier, the one with the black eyes, was now standing near the edge of the clearing, partially obscured by the trees. He didn't move. He just watched. I peeled out of the parking lot, my tires kicking up dirt. The road grew stranger the farther I drove. The trees seemed to shift, their shadows twisting into shapes that looked almost human. The air felt thick, like I was breathing through a damp cloth. Then I saw the lights. At first, I thought it was another car, a pair of headlights approaching in the distance. But as they drew closer, I realized they weren't headlights at all. They were two glowing orbs hovering about 6 feet off the ground. They stopped in the middle of the road, blocking my path. I hit the brakes, my hands trembling on the wheel. The orbs pulsed faintly, casting an eerie light on the road and trees around them. Then, slowly, they began to move toward me. Panic took over, and I threw the car into reverse. But the road behind me was gone, replaced by a dense wall of trees that hadn't been there moments before. The orbs were closer now, their glow intensifying, and then I saw them. Figures emerged from the woods, their bodies tall and emaciated, their faces featureless, except for those same black, empty eyes. They moved silently, their footsteps making no sound as they surrounded my car. I don't know how I escaped. One moment, they were pressing against the windows, their eyeless faces staring into mine, and the next, I was back on the highway, my car skidding to a stop in the breakdown lane. The detour sign was gone. I drove straight to the wedding without stopping again, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. I've told myself it was a hallucination, a trick of exhaustion and isolation. But sometimes late at night, I see those orbs in my dreams, and when I wake up, I swear I can hear footsteps outside my window.
Story number 9.
It was supposed to be a quick drive home from my parents' house, a 2-hour trip through the Pennsylvania countryside. I had taken this route dozens of times before, but that night, something felt different. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the road was eerily quiet. The radio cut out about 15 minutes in, leaving me alone with the hum of my engine and the occasional rustling of trees in the wind. As I turned onto a narrower road that cut through a dense forest, I noticed a sign I'd never seen before. Ashwood Hollow, 5 miles. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was a small town I'd never noticed. But as I drove on, the road seemed to stretch longer than I remembered, and the forest grew darker. Then my headlights caught something in the distance. A figure was walking along the side of the road, hunched over and shuffling slowly. As I got closer, I could see it was an old woman wearing a tattered shawl. Her gray hair hung in limp strands around her face, and she carried a wicker basket. I slowed down, debating whether to stop and offer her a ride, but something about her sent a shiver down my spine. Her head turned toward me, and I caught a glimpse of her face. It was wrong. Her eyes were too wide, her mouth stretched into a smile that seemed frozen in place. I hit the gas and sped past her, my heart racing. In my rearview mirror, she stood perfectly still, her face illuminated by the red glow of my taillights. A mile later, I saw her again. This time, she was standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as I came to a halt just feet away from her. She didn't move. Her head tilted to the side, and she raised one bony hand, pointing down the road. Terrified, I swerved around her and drove as fast as I could. My hands were shaking, and the air in the car felt stiflingly hot. The road began to change. The asphalt cracked and crumbled, giving way to uneven cobblestones. The trees on either side loomed closer, their branches twisting like skeletal hands. Then I saw the town. Ashwood Hollow wasn't a place. It was a nightmare. The buildings were decrepit, their windows shattered and roofs caved in. A faint, sickly green glow emanated from the streets, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I tried to turn around, but the road behind me was gone, replaced by more of the strange cobblestones. I had no choice but to keep driving. As I passed through the town, I saw them. Figures stood in the shadows, their faces obscured. Some were pressed against the windows of the crumbling buildings, their hands leaving smudges on the glass. Others stood in doorways, their heads slowly turning to follow my car. One by one, they began stepping into the street. Their movements were slow but deliberate, and their eyes, those hollow empty sockets, never left me. Panic surged as I floored the gas, weaving around them as they closed in. My headlights illuminated their faces, each one twisted into a grotesque expression of pain or rage. And then I saw her again. The old woman was standing at the edge of the town, her basket in hand. This time she was laughing, a low, guttural sound that echoed in the silent night. She raised her hand and pointed once more. I had no choice but to follow the road. It led me out of the town, but the horrors didn't stop. The trees grew thicker, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. The air was heavy, and the smell of damp earth and decay filled the car. Finally, the road ended abruptly at a wooden bridge spanning a black, sluggish river. A sign next to it read, "You can't leave until she lets you." The laughter started again, louder this time, echoing all around me. I don't remember crossing the bridge. The next thing I knew, I was parked on the side of the highway, my car covered in mud and leaves. The sun was rising, casting the world in golden light. I don't take back roads anymore. I don't even drive at night if I can help it, because sometimes in the silence of the evening, I hear her laughter in the distance, and I know she's still waiting for me to return.
Story number 10.
It started as any road trip would. Bright-eyed excitement, the hum of the open road, and the promise of adventure. My friends, Jack, Laura, and I, were driving through the American Midwest, chasing the ghost towns we had read about online. It was supposed to be one of those quirky road trips where we'd take cheesy pictures and laugh about spooky legends over campfires. But nothing prepared us for what we encountered. We were about 2 days into our journey when we heard about Havens Hollow. A man at a gas station told us about it, a forgotten town not far off our route. He spoke about it as if it were a dare. "Nobody goes to Havens Hollow," he warned, his voice low. "They say it's cursed. People who wander in don't always wander back out." Jack smirked. "Sounds like our kind of place." The gas station clerk just shook his head. "If you go, stick to the main road. Don't stop. Don't look back." The warning should have deterred us, but it only added to the allure. By the time the sun began to set, we were driving through an unmarked road, our GPS flickering in and out, struggling to pinpoint our location. The road was eerily quiet. No streetlights, no signs, just an endless stretch of asphalt cutting through dense woods. The deeper we drove, the more the air changed. It grew heavy, almost suffocating, and the woods seemed to press closer, their branches clawing at the car as if trying to pull us in. And then we saw it, the faded, splintering wooden sign that read, "Welcome to Havens Hollow. Population, unknown." The town was little more than a collection of decaying buildings, their windows shattered and doors hanging loosely on rusted hinges. The silence was deafening. Not even the chirp of a cricket broke the stillness. Against better judgment, Jack parked the car. "I mean, we drove all this way," he said, grabbing a flashlight. "Let's at least look around." Laura hesitated. The clerk said not to stop. Jack laughed. The clerk also said the town was cursed. Come on, Laura, it's just an abandoned town. Against my gut instinct, I followed them. The air felt colder as we stepped into the town. Each step echoed unnaturally as if the ground beneath us were hollow. The flashlight beams danced off decrepit walls and graffiti that read things like, "Leave now, and it sees you." "What's that smell?" Laura asked, wrinkling her nose. It was faint at first, like rotting meat, but it grew stronger the further we walked. Jack shone his flashlight toward the source, a small, dilapidated church at the edge of the town square. Its doors were ajar, swinging slightly despite the lack of wind. "Let's check it out," Jack said. "No," I said firmly. "We've seen enough. Let's just go." But Jack was already heading toward it, Laura reluctantly following. I cursed under my breath and jogged after them. The church interior was worse than the outside. Broken pews lay scattered across the floor, and the altar was blackened as if it had been burned. Strange symbols were scrawled across the walls in a deep, rusty red. And then we saw it, a figure in the corner, hunched and unmoving. "Hello?" Jack called, his voice shaking slightly. The figure turned slowly. It wasn't human. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the flashlight like an animal's. Its face was pale, stretched too tightly over a skull, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin revealing jagged teeth. We froze. The thing let out a guttural sound, a mix between a growl and a laugh, and lunged. Jack screamed and dropped the flashlight, plunging us into darkness. I grabbed Laura's hand and bolted, dragging her out of the church and back toward the car. "Jack!" Laura screamed. "Where's Jack?" There was no time to think. I shoved her into the passenger seat and jumped into the driver's side. The keys were still in the ignition. As the engine roared to life, something slammed against the car. In the rearview mirror, I saw Jack, or what used to be him. His face was twisted, his eyes hollow, and his body moved in jerky, unnatural motions. He clawed at the car, his nails screeching against the metal. I hit the gas, and the car sped down the road, but Jack, or that thing, chased us. He was impossibly fast, keeping up with the car no matter how much I accelerated. The woods seemed alive, the branches reaching out, scratching at the windows as if trying to trap us. "Don't look back!" I screamed, remembering the gas station clerk's warning. Laura sobbed, clutching the seatbelt as the car hurtled down the dark road. The smell of rot filled the car, stronger than ever. My knuckles turned white as I gripped the steering wheel, praying for the main road to appear. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The woods parted, and we found ourselves on a well-lit highway. The smell vanished, the oppressive weight lifted, and the night seemed normal again. We didn't speak as we drove, too shaken to process what had happened. It wasn't until we stopped at a motel hours later that we realized something was still wrong. Jack's phone was in the back seat, but Jack wasn't. We called the police, but there wasn't much to tell them without sounding insane. They promised to investigate, but I knew they wouldn't find him. Whatever took Jack wasn't something they could comprehend. I don't go on road trips anymore. I don't even drive at night. I still see Jack's face in my nightmares, twisted and wrong, and I can still hear that thing's guttural laugh echoing in my head. If you ever find yourself near Havens Hollow, do yourself a favor. Keep driving. Don't stop. Don't look back.